VIgil with Scott Ludlam, who is an Australian former senator with the Greens in Australia, and he's been, he's been a supporter and involved with WikiLeaks for quite a long time, and probably a bit longer than maybe some of our viewers have been sort of following this story. Because I know a lot of new supporters kind of came onto the scene in 2016. So I want to ask you, Scott, can you please explain for us how you became a supporter or involved with WikiLeaks and kind of the history around that for those who don't know?
Yeah, for sure. And good morning or good evening or wherever it is, where everybody is. So my background in this stuff goes back to about 2009. So for those who don't know me, I was a senator in the Australian Parliament for the Australian Greens Party. The Australian electoral system allows for quite a bit more diversity in the Senate, and so we have quite a large team. And so I was responsible, among other things, for communications issues. And one of my first campaigns actually was against an internet filter. So the government, kind of a bit out of the blue and a bit covertly and dishonestly, had started work in the background on an internet filter that was very broad in scope, that would effectively be screening incoming content from people. You wouldn't necessarily know that it was happening. The government was making very strange and contradictory claims about the scope of the internet filter. And it looked like a disastrous and really clumsy attempt at internet censorship by people who genuinely didn't know what they were doing. And in 2009, the blacklist, which was the kind of contested, the core of the issue, I guess. So what is it exactly that the government's filtering against? Once we'd blown away some of the misinformation, I guess, that was being spread around. And the government's case, obviously, is that we have this list. It's going to be entirely terrorism and child pornography. It's stuff that's so vile that nobody in their right mind would want it to be accessible live on the web. And of course, it will never leak. The list is safe. We've probably all heard claims from governments of various characters about how great their security is and how watertight their various projects are. Anyway, 2009, the blacklist, surprise, surprise, was leaked by this organization that I was only very dimly aware of, called WikiLeaks. And it disclosed that the list was twice the size of what the government had claimed, and there was stuff on there that had absolutely no business being there whatsoever. Stuff that was quite clearly political content. Some of it was objectionable as hell, but it was clearly political content. And the government had already been under fire for accidentally blocking a dentist website because they shared an IP address with something questionable. So it broke the issue open. And probably won't surprise you to hear that it was extremely polarizing. It's like, who the hell are these people who've released this list of the most toxic stuff on the internet that the government is trying to block? So obviously it immediately, it was an extremely provocative act. And from the point of view of the campaign, it was extremely valuable because finally we knew what we were dealing with. And so we just kind of took it from there. So obviously that's a year before the collateral murder video went live. It's a year before the Iraq and Afghanistan war logs and Cablegate that kind of turned the world upside down. And obviously it was well before the prosecutions began. It was before the Department of Justice investigation. It was before the real backlash swung into place. If you look at the publication history of WikiLeaks up until that date, it's an incredible record, actually. And I encourage people. It's not super well presented on the WikiLeaks webpage in terms of how easy it is to find, but there's a remarkable 10-year, 10 million documents history, and I can bung the address of that up online if you like.
That would be fantastic.
Yeah.
And if our tech can, if our social media people can look for that as well, and just throw it into chat on the various platforms for people, that would be fantastic. So,
and cutting you off. So it's wikileaks.org/10years/timeline.html, and it's just a remarkable chronology. And there'll be stuff there, I suspect, that will surprise people, even who are reasonably familiar with the work of the organization. So it kicks off in 2006 when they register the site. Their first drop, according to this list in 2006, is inside Somalia and the Union of Islamic Courts. There's stuff here on US military equipment, the looting of Kenya, which I think maybe was the first one that I was kind of dimly aware of. And it's just this incredible documentation of corruption and violence around the world. So once we'd sort of done our legwork a little bit and discovered a bit more about the organization, and then obviously 2010 happened, when the prosecutions began and when it looked as though the organization was going to be subject to very serious attack, one of my colleagues made contact with the crew in London, and we kind of took it from there. So I traveled to London in 2011 and then again in 2012 after Julian Assange had gone into the embassy, and have maintained an association with some of those folks since then. So kind of seen the you know, not as long as others, and obviously I've not worked for the organization or been directly involved, but I've seen just how significantly things have changed from the early days to where we are now. And that's why I'm really pleased to be part of this event. And I want to thank you and everybody who's been involved in putting it together. It's a huge effort.
Well, I'm so glad that you can bring that perspective to this vigil. As somebody who, although you were not involved in the organization yourself, you've been watching this develop for this number of years, where we've seen this shift from sort of left-wing media supporting WikiLeaks to left-wing media disliking WikiLeaks, from right-wing media disliking WikiLeaks to briefly seeming to be more lenient. And I know that you wrote an article recently that sort of described WikiLeaks and Julian Assange as a Rorschach test. Can you describe kind of the basic contents of that article for people that didn't read it, and the way that you feel the way that we look at WikiLeaks may have changed, but WikiLeaks hasn't, possibly?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of both. Like, I think the organization has also clearly changed since the early days, but so have our perceptions of it quite radically. So there's a great political daily online journal in Australia called Crikey, just crikey.org, and so you can find the article there. And I guess I'm interested in precisely that context that you're speaking of like in the US context, at least, when it's Republican wars being exposed, the progressive media around the world is rightly interested in the material that's being disclosed, and then, in a collateral kind of a way, pardon the pun, interested in the organization that's putting this material into the public domain. But principally, and I guess speaking for myself, the disclosures in 2010 told us stuff about our government's conduct, like the Australian government's conduct in those wars, and the gap, the distance between the officially curated version of the truth and the raw material of State Department cables and the raw material of the war logs is so vast that it's like, obviously this is in the public interest that this material is putting into the public domain so that it can be analyzed and discussed. And maybe, on balance, we decide in a democratic way that the invasion of Iraq, which killed 1 million people, was a great idea, and the US government has everything under control. Or maybe we come to very different conclusions, but at least we have the source material. But of course, you fast forward to 2016, if this very same organization and some of the same people are disclosing evidence of really deep corruption inside the US Democratic Party, which cooked its own primary to strongly advantage one candidate over another, in that fevered environment with the Team Trump on the rampage, and all of the unarguably queasy circumstances surrounding the nature of those leaks, where they may or may not have come from, then it's turned everything completely inside out. Like suddenly we don't think it's in the public interest to know these things. In fact, it's in the public interest that this organization be dismantled and smashed. And I suppose I'm interested in that dynamic, partly because it was foreshadowed. It was foreshadowed years ago, this set of PowerPoint slides by this nasty little cohort of H.B. Gary and Palantir and one other little entity, which looked as though it was a pitch document to the US government to how to destroy a network like WikiLeaks. They're decentralized, they're very fast, they're streamlined, they're extremely flexible. They're obviously a very tight-knit and very committed little group. This is not like going up against a kind of adversary we might be used to. How do you destroy a network like that? And I think it's highly likely that although that little organization was disrupted when the slides went up on WikiLeaks and that wasn't put into play, some vastly more professionalized version of that strategy has absolutely been in play, because look at where we stand now.
Absolutely. I think that's unquestionable. Like, there's no doubt that that's exactly what has happened. But the fact that those slides were published was extremely helpful, and it has been helpful in pointing out the parallels when we see the exact attack strategies that are in those documents played out over and over again. And so how do you think, how do you feel that that the Unity 4J movement has kind of addressed some of the I don't want to say just bad press, but the way that WikiLeaks and its, scientific journalism has been so misrepresented and just, smeared from all sides, from all sorts of different establishment outlets. Do you think that this is kind of helping people sort of wake up to any, it's sort of like, rebuilding a conception of WikiLeaks, or do you think that, that it's just sort of fighting for us? I mean, I don't know. I'm just trying to get your thoughts on how we can recover from that kind of polarization around WikiLeaks.
Look, I think that's exactly what you're doing, and we're in uncharted waters in a way. But that's why I'm really happy to participate, because I think that's exactly what this is. It's an attempt to build unity of purpose around just a very narrow perspective, if you like. I mean, people bring obviously really different agendas to this, and there are people on this link up who probably would like to back a car over people like me, that we can come together around the unity of purpose that prosecuting publishers is dangerous, and prosecuting publishers in particular on a day that you disagree with what it is that they're disclosing because it doesn't suit your agenda is particularly dangerous, because tomorrow that publisher might be putting something else into the public domain. And it's that canary in the coal mine factor that I think the who was it? Because it was actually quite it was quite recent. It's the Deputy General Counsel of the New York Times giving a speech about 2 weeks ago, saying not expressing any kind of agenda about the role of WikiLeaks in particular or the character of any of the people involved, but just any prosecution that takes this organization down hits the New York Times as well. And that's what they've been saying for years. It's like, this is a publishing organization, suck it up. On some days, it's going to mess with your agenda a bit, the stuff that they publish. That's publishing. That's, there's hundreds of years of precedent and practice around that. And so I think what the Unity Project is doing is aligning a bunch of very, very different people from very different perspectives around that singular agenda. It's like, you don't go after a publisher just because you don't like what they publish. There's no, as far as I'm aware anyway, you might have seen different. There's no accusation that anything this organization has ever released has been fraudulent. Now, there are big disagreements about whether some of this stuff has been in the public interest to publish, or arguments around redactions, or the different kind of approach that Ed Snowden took, for example. But nobody's come at this organization, as far as I'm aware, even the bad guys, and said they've published misinformation, either intentionally or unintentionally.
I think. And I think that's really important. I want to just add in that what you brought up earlier about those slides from Palantir and HB Gary, they actually did mention submitting false documents to kind of mar their reputation. And obviously, although they probably tried, WikiLeaks hasn't fallen for it, because they're meticulous in the way that they verify the documents that they publish. So that is all to their credit, for sure.
Yeah,
because we know they tried to do that. Oh, sorry.
No, I think that it's a really good point. That and the accusation that they publish false information, or the accusation that some of these disclosures got people killed. And there's, to their credit, I guess, there's actually very senior US defense and intelligence people who debunked that and said, no, this was extremely embarrassing to us, but it didn't get anybody killed. and that, there's a number of folk on the record who've confirmed that. Because I think it also, again, and maybe it is a bit of a misnomer, they do redact stuff. They do attempt to ensure that people aren't hurt in the course of publishing this material. So if that's where we stand, and what's blown this up is the incredible volatility of the Trump administration, some of the cross-cutting agendas running inside that administration. We've got the candidate in 2016, and then all the way through the campaign celebrating the existence of WikiLeaks and what it was publishing, because it gave him, at least a perceived tailwind. He thought it was benefiting him. While you've got very, very senior officials inside the Trump administration now ramping up attempts to set this DOJ prosecution in motion. That's why I think it's important that we've got voices from all sides of politics on this, because we're going to need it. Even if, sorry, there are cats in the house, so that's a background noise.
No problem.
If we finally get Julian his passport back and get him back to Australia, we may go back to town on each other over all the other things that we disagree on. But it's a fortunate moment that we agree on this, not just for the benefit of Julian, who's now spending his, I think, 6th year in a very, very small space. And I've spent a little bit of time in there. It's not a large space. Not just for his benefit, obviously, but for the larger precedent that will be set if he is prosecuted, even if he is extradited back to the US.
Absolutely. I think that is such a major point. And it's also good to emphasize that, as you're saying, it's not just, all of us agree on this point and therefore all the other differences don't exist. One of the really positive things that I like about Unity4J is that we're actually, at least I think it's really encouraging diversity. Like, it's okay to have differences of opinion, but we're putting the truth and supporting a truth teller above that ideology. It doesn't mean we have to erase it. It's just that, it's there is a higher priority that's happening here. And so I really value that. And I think, the uncertainty right now must be just excruciating for Julian Assange. We had some questions just before the last break about, what he might be going through. And I don't know if you have, I know that, you haven't been to the embassy recently, but do you have any insight into what might be going on emotionally for Assange right now? Because that was one of the questions that we had. Yeah.
I honestly wouldn't seek to speak for him. I've spent, so the last time I was in the embassy was last July, so July 17, and it was quite a brief visit. Actually, it was only about 90 minutes. And I've spent sort of longer spells over preceding years, but I definitely wouldn't seek to speak for his emotional state. I think really the closest and most valuable reading is some of the reporting that's come out from his consulting doctors who've spent a little bit of time with him in the last couple of months, who've issued actually remarkably strident warnings about the risks to his health, mental and physical, of being in that confined space for such a long time. That's not even going to the stress, I guess. That's just going to the physical confinement in such a small and inappropriate environment. It's a small office without direct sunlight into most of the rooms. And so reading, I guess, what his doctors have said on at least 2 occasions that I'm aware of, is that this is causing this very, very direct damage to his health. He's not free to leave, as the United Nations has made abundantly clear on a couple of occasions. He's not free to leave. And statements from Mr. Comey and Mr. Pompeo on down go to the fact that he's not free to leave. And so he's stuck. So I don't think I would have lasted as long, to be perfectly frank. When I think of all the stuff that I've done since 2012, all the people I've hung out with, all the places I've gone, imagining that he's been in there for that entire time, is it's kind of daunting what it is that he's gone through. So I feel as though there was a call, I think quite recently, by Jennifer Robinson, who's been one of his legal counsel for way longer than I've been involved in this stuff, was he gets his passport back and then he comes home. End of story. And that's something practical that the Australian government can do as well, because they've been let off the hook in an insane way for far too long. So there's something valuable and useful that they can do. He gets his passport back, and then he's given safe passage to the airport and comes home, if that's what he wants. That's my preference, but you know.
Yeah, that's actually a really great point. That brings up something that we discussed yesterday during the late night vigil, was that that Ecuador, for all of these years, as a small country in Latin America, has done so much for Julian and stood up to the US empire. And then Australia, which is a much larger country, like as far as GDP as well as size, etc., has basically done nothing yet. And so do you think there's a hope that they will stand up and do the right thing for one of their citizens?
Only if there's a lot of political pressure. I don't know whether the viewers on this thing have a great awareness of the political situation in Australia at the moment, but like my thumbnail sketch would be, our foreign defence policy is entirely derived by US government policy. These things do not get decided in Canberra, they're decided in DC, and they have been for 70 years. And that's very much been the case with this issue. This Australian foreign policy is entirely subservient to the interests of the US, and obviously we're one of the Five Eyes partners, surveillance partners. So Australia is very deeply enmeshed, and I suspect knows a lot more than it's telling about attempts to extradite Julian and get him into the US. And it's not just that they've done nothing; they've done worse than nothing. They've provided political cover to successive US administrations for the persecution of this organization. They've said almost nothing of value, and as long as I can remember, about even taking the individual persons out of the frame for a moment, just the principle of the prosecution of a publishing organization because they disclosed stuff that you didn't like. It's worse than nothing. It's complicity, and so I understand there have I hope there have anyway been some approaches made to the Foreign Minister's office about returning Julian's passport to him, which is lapsed, and then possibly the best thing that could happen is that he's simply deported, back to Australia. But I suspect, and I'll leave this up to the legal folk who are a lot closer to the situation than me. There may be other things in play. There may be other proposals. The most important thing, I guess, the single most important thing, is probably just from an Australian point of view, anyway, is a diplomatic effort to the Trump administration that their DOJ investigation is dropped immediately, because everything really flows from that, right? Like all the other various forms of weirdness flow from the fact that there's probably a sealed indictment against a publisher.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's a question that I often get when I ask people, especially Trump supporters, to pressure Trump as much as possible to preemptively pardon Assange. I get questions like, oh, well, what is he charged with? Why does he need to pardon him if he's not charged with anything? And the answer is, although I'm definitely not a legal mind at all, the answer is that it would protect him from any secret prosecution that you're like, as you are referring to.
Yeah. And I mean, the precedent under utterly different circumstances that I must admit to being surprised by, and obviously she was charged and had served significant time in the US military prison, was Chelsea Manning, who was pardoned and is now free and is politically active and is actually a really important voice in a couple of areas on these things. So I think that would certainly be one thing, and I don't think that's completely unreasonable to imagine this president doing, because actually I think he's capable of just about anything. Unpredictability first and foremost.
Definitely. I think that maybe one of the few good things about him is that I do think that he is at least somewhat malleable policy-wise based on what his base pressures him to do. He doesn't care what I as a Jill Stein voter want. He doesn't care what Democrats and progressives want. But I think when the actual conservative base really raises their voice at him, I do think that he hears it, and I do think to some extent that he listens. So that's why I think it's extremely important for the Trump side of things to pressure him as much as possible. But I was wondering though about. Oh, go ahead if you had a thought to add.
No, I mean, and I think you've got some guests on the stream over this weekend who could speak directly to that perspective. And,
Definitely.
these I disagree with on probably about 90% of their agenda,
Yeah.
but they've been more consistent on this than some of the folk on the left, actually, a lot of people.
Yeah,
And
unfortunately.
and that is partly a function, I think, of just how strange the political circumstance is, partly a function of the campaign, very targeted and systematic campaign against WikiLeaks. But we should also be honest that the organization itself has, occasionally does stuff that you would argue aren't in its best interest, stuff that confuses the politics, stuff that makes it difficult to be a good ally. And I think that is maybe a little bit difficult, but something that does need to be in the mix as well. There are people whose judgment I trust, who I've worked with for years, who have good politics, who are just like, no, I don't want to hear about this anymore. We're done. He gave us Trump. We're done. And that, I think, is part of the reason why what you crew are doing is so important, is that it's actually rebuilding a movement that was there and then took significant damage and has been partly dismantled and is now on its way back up again.
I agree, and I think that it is unfortunate that happened, but I also feel that I think that if an organization like WikiLeaks is true to its sort of its own motto about being transparent and opening up governments, et cetera, then if it doesn't piss you off politically at some point, then I feel like it wouldn't be doing its job. I think everybody should have been pissed off at WikiLeaks one time or another, based on whatever political perspective you come from. And I think that means that they're doing the right thing, to not stay on one side. I think that would be, I think that would be an indication of them not living up to what they've been so far. I don't think, and I definitely don't think anybody expects them to be an organization that, panders to anyone, if for lack of a better phrase. But
no, they'll have a crack at basically anybody. Again, go back to that list, the 10 years timeline list. It's remarkable. Nobody gets out of that one unscathed. It's including Russia, actually. Like there's a bunch of stuff there. It's absolutely worth the look.
Absolutely. I think relatively recently, I think in the last year, they published an entire release on Russia, which of course got no media attention whatsoever. Because I know that, as we discussed at the beginning of the segment, the media has been such a major determinator of how the public views WikiLeaks. And I know that we're, through this Unity 4J event, we are definitely trying to sort of take the narrative back from the establishment press. But do you have any thoughts on the way in which they have really, truly been utterly dishonest in covering Julian Assange, whether it's on factual issues like saying over and over again that he was, wanted on rape charges, or just in general smearing WikiLeaks? And why? And politics aside, left versus right aside, do you think that attack is more a symptom of, as John Pilger says, journalists, establishment journalists being stenographers for the state, or do you think it's just because of a left-right issue?
I think it's definitely more complicated than a left-right thing, yeah. And I think there's also signs of hope, like the New York Times piece that I referenced a little bit earlier. I think there are still some pretty senior establishment figures in the US and elsewhere who understand what's at stake and who are actually sticking with their principles. So it's not a complete wasteland. You still see the occasional straight up piece in The Guardian or in the New York Times or in other organizations that have come under sustained criticism by WikiLeaks and by its allies for the way that they've handled, the way that the politics of this thing have turned and shifted over time. Some of it, so I think, like Pilger's right in large measure, that some of it is just that there's a big safety zone in criticizing WikiLeaks at the moment and having a crack at them. Anybody with an even distant association with Julian or with the organization can get an opinion piece up in 10 seconds by saying, I've met the guy, I believed in his mission, but actually he's a total creep and here's why he's a sellout and here's why he's bad. You can get those pieces published really super easy. There's a little mini industry of that. And that's on the periphery of the mainstream and the large institutional press in the Western world, at least, who go to town on him because it's safe and because, lining up with centers of power is what some of these entities do. Like, it's in direct contradiction to their stated mission, but let's not be naive. That happens every single day. But I think it is even a little bit more, it's probably a lot more complicated than that, because no organization and no individual is above critique. Some of the critique is fair. Like, none of us should be above, even if we're doing incredibly valuable and important work. We're all going to get called out on stuff from time to time, and that's got to be part of it too. That's part, in a way, the freedom to do that is part of what we're fighting for. But and then some of it's personal, because WikiLeaks in the early days was partnering with these same organizations because they shared the same mission, because he had the valuable source material, because people trusted WikiLeaks as a cutout that would protect them as sources, in the sense that then the material would actually be published. Now, I don't have the reference in front of me, but my understanding, I forget which publication it was, you might remember, or some of the crew on here might remember, the collateral murder video had been lying around on news desks for a while, until the WikiLeaks crew cut it up and put it into public domain. So I think all of those things are going on at the same time. Some of it's personal. There have been major personal fallings out with individual editors and individual journalists who are on side and who've had strong, strident disagreements, and then they get played out in the editorial pages and in op-eds and so on. So that's a huge mashup of complicated stuff, and that's why I think we've got to keep this simple. You don't publish, you don't punish and prosecute publishers. That happens in dictatorships. That doesn't
exactly
happen in democracies. And if we see it happening in parts of the world that consider themselves to have a free press, then we have to push back on it, no matter who our damn allies are.
Exactly. And as somebody said yesterday as well, that, obviously everybody's three-dimensional. No one is perfect. And if this vigil was based on everyone's, agreeing that Assange was perfect or something, that would be ridiculous. And we're not here to be a cult of personality. I think that it's really important to recognize the complexities of everything, but also to say, as your message is, that putting all of that aside, the integrity, the place of integrity is to say that no one, no matter what, should be prosecuted for practicing journalism and for publishing accurate information. It's ridiculous. Yeah. So, and I think Susie's made that point a number of times, that, while we're fighting over what, and not that you are, but while people fight over what Julian might say on Twitter before he was isolated, or whether it's, the political intrigues of whatever, he's slowly deteriorating, as his doctors have said in the embassy, and we don't, address that. So yeah, I think that all of that is worth going over. But I was also wondering if you had any advice for those who are listening, who have been kind of like joining this Unity 4J Discord server, who want to help. Do you have any thoughts about how you think that this movement should move forward to be the most helpful, or how people can spend their efforts to try and make a positive difference?
I think, in a way, at the stage of things that we're at, where you could literally be ejected from the embassy any day if Ecuador cuts a deal either with the British or with the United States government, and they come up with whatever it is that they're trying to put together. This could all move very, very fast. So, and then the situation changes, because then, I don't pretend to predict what it's going to look like or what would unfold, but it moves very heavily back into a legal domain. There will presumably be long-running extradition footings. Julian will be incarcerated the entire time, most likely, and the situation changes. So we have this window, and we don't know how long it is before that happens. And obviously that's something that the main purpose is to prevent that occurring at all. To build the network and build the crowd and build numbers, and maybe that's just a dramatic oversimplification, but I feel like at the moment, every time I see a tweet by like a large mainstream, more institutional human rights organization, see something like the Freedom of the Press Foundation, who maybe have been a bit quiet, or Human Rights Watch, who haven't, like they've been out. Anytime you see these larger groups who are obviously taking the time and working through the internal politics of what kind of position to take, is to amplify that. At the moment, I feel as though we need to build the crowd, and we need to remind ourselves that we're not fighting from some kind of extremist position here. It's very, very mainstream opinion to try and protect a publisher when they're under attack from an angry superpower. That's not a complicated message to be able to share. And keeping it simple, and at the moment I think it's signal boosting, and it's working, but because we can do that whatever time zone we're in, and then it's working within our own political environments and political contexts. If you're in the US, there are people you can work with. If you're in the UK, you can go down to Knightsbridge if you have time and actually be physically present, or lobby the government there. If you have legal advice, you can lend a hand. If you're an artist, if you're an activist, if you're whatever. I feel like at the moment it's about building the crowd, and that's why what your crew are doing is important. Reminding each other in our various constituencies that we're still there. This hasn't gone away. This is a fuse that got lit in 2010. It's about to go off, and this is kind of where we need people.
Absolutely. I think those are some great sentiments for our audience to hear, and great advice. I think I was also wanting to get your opinion, if you have any insights on what on earth do you think sort of happened in the last couple of weeks? I know that you attended the emergency event that we had when news sort of broke that Assange might be illegally expelled from his place of asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy. Do you think the VIgil itself had any impact on that, or do you think they backed off for some reason we'll never know? I mean, I'm not asking you to give us any sort of concrete answer, but I was just wondering what your thoughts might be on how the last couple of weeks has developed in a very strange way.
Yeah, truly. I think there were, starting with that piece on the Intercept, I guess. I don't know, if anything, I took a little bit of hope from that. If there was going to be an easy deal, they would have done it. They would have done it whenever that was, like 2 or 3 weeks ago. It would have been done. There's obviously something complex and something being put together that is more complicated than it looks from the outside. Because if they wanted to just throw him out and put him into a van, that would have already have occurred. So something's being put together which just buys us this little window of time. As for whether the VIgil was played a part in that, like goodness only knows, but it can't have hurt, right? Like visible public support, which they've been chipping away at and trying to smash for 8 years, is important. It really matters. There's no question at all that it's also not being observed and tabulated and mapped and watched. And so, in that circumstance, the more of us there are, the safer it is. So we just got to keep turning up the volume.
I completely agree. And I was really, and I mentioned this with Jamal in the last segment. I was so, inspired to see so many Ecuadorians protesting in front of the embassy against Lenin Moreno's, policy, and also the fact that he was visiting the UK at the time. I thought it was a great indication of the way in which it seems that Ecuadorian citizens do not want to become a vassal state of the US empire. They don't want Lenin Moreno to go back on what he campaigned for, as far as continuing to protect Julian Assange. And, I wish, or at least I was wondering as well, I mean, we know that the Ecuadorian government must be under constant, incredible pressure in a lot of different ways. Do you have any thoughts on how it was that Lenin Moreno, who was, sort of campaigned on the idea of being Correa's successor, shifted to this person whose policy seems to have been to, bend to the United States will in some ways?
Yeah, look, I have no kind of insight or visibility into that. I guess I'm reading it the same way as most people are, is that there is vast diplomatic and possibly commercial pressure being placed on getting this fixed, getting this problem fixed. And I think it's a great reminder actually that you point that out, because speaking for myself, I don't read Spanish. I'm sort of steeped in the Western press, and my view of how this is playing out is actually very narrow. I'm in my own little my own little filter bubble, I guess, of the media sources and so on that I get. The way that WikiLeaks is regarded in Latin America and elsewhere in the world is fundamentally different, actually, because they were seen as an incredibly important part of a deeply asymmetrical fight against the way that the US government has wielded its power over that continent for 100 years. So he's got a lot of allies there. And as for the internal Ecuadorian politics of how this was done, I guess all we can hope is that one of the reasons that there's been this delay, that there hasn't been this eviction and we kind of get thrown into the next stage of wherever this is going, is that internal political pressure by people who actually deeply supported what Correa had done. It was a very popular decision.
Absolutely. And I completely agree. I completely agree with the popularity of that. And I think the popular support for the continuation of that type of independence and, solidarity with Assange and WikiLeaks. I mean, if I was an Ecuadorian citizen, I would be incredibly proud of that history and for standing up to the US for that many years. So, I think that there's definitely cause to think that would hopefully weigh on Lenin Moreno's mind as he's dealing with this. But and I asked this question of Jamal Thomas in the last segment as well, but I want to ask it of you as well. And, one of the more cynical, I'm dropping my pen. One of the more cynical ways you can look at this is to say that, once Lenin Moreno expels Julian Assange, hands him over, if that happens, that will be a loss of leverage. And so I wonder if this is a thing where he's sort of, maybe yes, maybe no, he's wanting to keep this bargaining chip, as cynical as it is to say it that way. Do you think that plays a role in what we're seeing happen?
Again, I'm not going to pretend to have any expertise on this stuff. I've seen that line of thinking going around, and I guess it's the way that practiced diplomats and politicians behave. If he's got an objective in mind, as I'll give you this and you give me that, then obviously the deal hasn't been done yet. But like I feel as though what's actually happening behind the scenes is incredibly opaque, and unfortunately, the organization that we would normally trust to bring us the internal workings of stuff like this is WikiLeaks. It's precisely the organization that's under assault.
Absolutely. And I know that Jennifer Robinson said recently in an interview that although there is that process and that negotiation going on between the Ecuadorian and UK governments, the WikiLeaks legal team, the Julian Assange legal team, are not allowed to be part of that. So they're kept in the dark as well. So I think that's and that's why I asked the question. That's why I want to get the panelists' insight, because we don't know. And it has been very frustrating that things have been so confusing. I mean, just in terms of, when Vice President Pence visited with Moreno, there was back and forth dialogue on whether they'd raised Assange as an issue, and then the same thing when he visited the UK, etc. And so, it is a bit frustrating, and I cannot imagine what it's like to be inside that and deal with that level of uncertainty. But
yeah, truly, and I mean, all of this incredible. Like, I don't know in the United States, who is the constituency that they think is served by prosecuting Julian and potentially a lot of other people as well. There are plenty of other people who put a lot of time and love into this organization, who don't have the profile, who are living under the shadow of this thing as well. Who's the constituency in the United States for prosecuting these people? And this is why I guess I fear the measure by which the issues around Russian interference in the US election are being beaten up and laid entirely at the door of WikiLeaks at the moment, because that sets up an incredibly dangerous political dynamic where they will just be thrown to the wolves, and that'll be seen as the fix. That I think in a way is the great risk. But like, all of this could be made to go away by giving him his passport back, deporting him with a stern warning to not come back to Melbourne, and then the issue disappears.
I completely agree, and I feel like if our governments in the West, whether it's in Australia, the UK, or the US, were actually, if they were actually working for the benefit of the people, then that would be exactly what would happen. But I feel it seems to be that there is a sense of vengeance from the intelligence communities of the UK and the US. Maybe they feel embarrassed. I'm not sure, but there is this real, true ire against WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. And I don't know exactly what it is that causes that, other than just them being exposed for the first time in their existence by WikiLeaks. But I would say that's the constituency that you mentioned that is being served by the persecution of Assange and WikiLeaks.
It's terrifying. I think you're spot on. Like the very first speech I think that Pompeo gave as CIA director was this incredibly venomous and unhinged rant. And I think you're right. It was about vengeance and this whole foreign or non-state intelligence agency weirdness that they kind of plucked out of nowhere. So I think you're right. One of the constituencies is certainly an internal one. It's everybody with security clearance inside the US that says, this is what happens if you cross the line. This is being read out as a warning to a bunch of other people. But I guess it is important to remember that that in any sane world, and maybe we crossed that line a long time ago, if you campaign in your election campaign on the importance of transparency in the public interest, and then you turn about after you're elected and you persecute the very people who you're celebrating during the campaign, that is going to piss off a segment of your base. And I have no way of weighing up how importantly that weighs in their minds. I guess this is what we're going back to earlier. Who exactly is Trump listening to? Is he listening to these folk on the alt-right and some of the other sort of supporters or people in the base who are saying, we like them then, we've got to stick with them now? Or more likely, is he listening to his new Secretary of State and his CIA director? And, this is the stuff that I guess is most troubling.
I agree. I think that he is probably listening to those around him. And I think that's extremely concerning. And I think that does, unfortunately, give us an idea of what the policy will be moving forward. And although that's not encouraging, I think it's best to kind of expect the worst case scenario so that you can do the best you can, if that happens, and then feel like it's a bonus if it doesn't. But unfortunately, I think that's a really accurate sum up of the sort of reasons possibly for the flip of Trump from saying I love WikiLeaks to having, Pompeo and Sessions very clearly state that Assange and WikiLeaks will be prosecuted to the full extent that they can. Do you have any thoughts about not just, the movement moving forward as far as Unity 4J? And I know that you've talked about the history of WikiLeaks and how you got involved, but just from your perspective personally, like the value of WikiLeaks as a whole, as an organization, is there any particular release that really resonated with you on a personal level that you can share with our audience, or just an impact that they've had on the world that struck you particularly?
I mean, I don't know, maybe people are a bit tired of hearing about it, but like a lot of other people, I was involved in 2002 and 2003 in the peace movement in Australia with millions, tens of millions of people around the world in attempting to prevent the invasion of Iraq. And so I think the stuff that hit me most profoundly was around the time of collateral murder and after, that it was just like this 1, 2, 3, 4 punch from collateral murder through to the state tables, where it was like, we're getting this slice here into how empire actually functions. Like the machinery, the working parts, what actually happens behind these shells and layers of deceit and fabrication and bullshit that we're kind of having to wade through every day about the virtue of government policy and how everything's under control. And then you get to see under the hood as to how these people think and how power actually operates. I feel like that's, even though that's kind of the probably a really cheap one to pick because they're the most high profile for, but that I guess made a lasting impression on me, and everything that's happened since then has only amplified that in a way.
Yeah, I think that that's completely valid, because what you're describing is really the dynamic that's at play in almost, all of their releases. It's always showing us that insider perspective in their own words, and I guess, as Hillary Clinton put it, the public versus private position. And I think that having that insight, a lot of people have observed this, but I want to say it anyway. It has revolutionized not just journalism, but I think the way that politics now operates, because it's like this existence where there's every chance that any propaganda narrative will be debunked very quickly within the creation of it, where that didn't happen before. We just saw what the establishment wanted us to see. And so for my and insight so consistently into the behind the scenes of the establishment and the power structure.
So I guess maybe we've answered again one of your earlier questions about why the fever to shut this thing down, and I think that's precisely the reason why. Because, like, God help an active, informed, politically literate citizenry with accurate information about what's actually going on. My God, that could change the world. And so I think what's being done here, and others, more articulately than me, have pointed this out, particularly people like Glenn Greenwald and others, is you take one particularly, the way that this is played out anyway, divisive, polarizing guy who's actually, like, not pretending to be a moderate or play by the rules. You could argue he's playing by the oldest rules of publishing, but you take him out and you strip away the allies and the kind of protective armor of moderate institutions and other publishing organizations. You make an example of him, where a lot of people are either going to be too frightened or, justifiably, in my view, too confused to step up and say this is a kind of a black and white thing. And you smash that organization as hard as you can as an example to everybody else that these are the lines you don't cross again in future. That's catastrophic. That's a disaster. Whatever your views on Julian Assange personally, or on mistakes that the organization made, that is a catastrophe if that is allowed to happen, because that sets the bar for everybody else in the publishing world, everybody who comes after.
And I think that is a horrifically low bar to set if it's allowed to happen that way. That would be, the death knell of even the concept of, like Western liberal ideals, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we can say that those ideals were, not lived up to. But prior to WikiLeaks, there was definitely corruption. But I think at that stage, if, what you're describing plays out, there won't even be the pretense anymore. It'll be the real death of even the concept of ideals of free speech, of democracy, of a free press, et cetera, et cetera.
And I think, in a way, the idea, and I know it's contested, and I think the contest itself is healthy, but this concept of scientific journalism is we're going to trust the public with the raw material, like with the source code to Empire, with the original stuff. We're going to protect people who might be vulnerable or, unable to protect themselves. So we're going to do the redactions, but apart from that, we're going to dump the entire source material into the public domain, and then the journalistic community and the writers and the analysts and the academics are going to have at it. That model is kind of out of the box. Like, and maybe others on this thing would have a really different view of this, but I guess what I've been wondering is, there's nothing stopping 1,000 other WikiLeaks being set up. The blind Dropbox idea is brilliant. It's not exactly rocket science. Okay, that can be done now. And I think, in a way, what's under attack here, as well as the individuals who are involved in these networks, is that very concept. It's like, no, this is what happens to people who do that, who trust the public enough to throw this material into the public domain in the first place. And that, I think, is the real threat here.
Absolutely.
Leaks, and it's to the WikiLeaks that come after.
Absolutely. And I think that, as you're saying, we can also see that same mechanism at play when we look at the attempt to persecute Edward Snowden after, with his releases, et cetera, et cetera. So anyone who would try to replicate what WikiLeaks has done would definitely face the same type of attempt to not just quash their efforts, but to make an example of them. But yeah. I'm hoping that, well, actually, let me ask this one last question. We have about 5 minutes left. First, is there anything else that we haven't covered that you'd like to speak about? And if not, though, do you think that the way that Assange's story resolves is going to determine the way this century unfolds, as far as the way that our civilization sort of evolves? I know that's a huge question, but if you have anything else that you'd like to just address in the last 5 minutes, then go right ahead.
I think, in a way, that's what we were just discussing. So this is a precedent case for an important and, quite relatively innovative model of journalism or model of publishing being done that had been enabled by forms of technology that didn't really exist before. And so this is our precedent case. How does the planet, or how do powerful institutions resolve that precedent case that if you're involved in systematically fabricating, if you're lying, if you're engaged in massive institutional deceit, that suddenly there are consequences in a way that there weren't before? How do you react to that? That's, I guess, what we were sort of dancing around before. This is the precedent case. How this resolves tells future publishers, large and small, innovative or conservative or whatever, that you can't do that anymore. You're not allowed to do that. Look, we don't want to end up like those people who we don't like anyway, because they're weird. So I feel as though, yes, that does have consequences. That has unforeseeable consequences way into the future. That this form of publishing will be met in these kind of ways: character assassination, destruction of your trust networks, destruction of your of any partnerships that you might have engaged in. So just don't do that. Go back to doing things the way where you maybe self-censor a hell of a lot more, which is the opposite of the WikiLeaks model. So yeah, I think it has enormous consequences. But obviously, this isn't. It's one of many. A misstep on nuclear weapons diplomacy in Iran could also end the game overnight. There are a lot of those things, but the way that we form views on all these other campaigns and these other issues going around the world is with accurate information. And if you choke that, everything else that we're working on becomes immeasurably more difficult as well.
I completely agree.
Communicate with each other and the right to understand what these institutions are actually doing, then it's actually really difficult to work on nuclear disarmament or to work on any of the other things that we might care about.
That is an extremely important point. And on that note, thank you, Scott, for joining us and spending this time with us and giving your insight into this issue. And I hope that we see you again in the next vigil if we are in this position again. So I really appreciate your time with us.
And to you too. Thank you so much.